Svana took up the scroll and wound the wooden spools to read. Environment. Nature, in this context, refers to the expression of innate evolutionary design in the manifestation of entities. It includes propensities of understanding that are built in as a result of the natural selection that has taken place in the forebears of the entity in question. All entities are born with built-in characteristics and resulting abilities. The born state of an entity is a functional structure that will survive in its pertinent environment to the extent it is able to make successful use of that functional structure. The functional design of an entity provides a template by which its most effective application can be surmised. To comprehend the nature of innate evolutionary design, it is necessary to consider how it is developed and how it forms within an environment to both create and require the interconnectedness of the entities that inhabit the environment. Nurture in this context refers to the mechanisms employed to increase the probability that a given entity will reach its potential through its manifestation. In the first place, nurture is a matter of innate subjective intent. The instinct to nurture is built into the experience of the organism. Throughout the generational evolution of the organism, the intent to nurture proved vital. This is especially true for humans whose offspring remain vulnerable for an extended period of time. Without the innate influential interest to nurture, the species would not have survived. Nurture does not consist only of the intent to protect the young until maturity. Effective nurturing consists of feeding and exercising the specific innate aspects of the individual that will strengthen the probability of attaining the full manifestation of potential within the environment. Effective nurturing also consists of starving and suppressing the development of innate aspects that will undermine the individual's full attainment of potential. Effective nurturing of capability towards potential requires a consideration of how strengthening is accomplished, and how and for what purpose that strengthened capacity may be most beneficially employed in the environment of the individual. Nature, biosystems, biodiversity, development. Biodiversity is the result of the evolution of an environment and the organisms the environment supports. The combination of specific matter and specific energy is the seed force that contains specific potential. As an environment changes due to a shifting combination of matter and energy, so does the expression of it change in terms of the characteristics of the organisms it allows to develop, and which of those it ultimately supports. The potential of the environment is contained within its latent material complexity, which unfolds over time to the extent it is energized. Different environments give rise to the potential for different organisms to manifest. As such, a less involved environment gives rise to less evolved organisms. Organisms grow out of environments that provide a basis for their support. They then feed on that environment and thrive to the extent allowed by the provisioning the environment offers, as limited by the influence of competing elements within the environment. Within that macro context, micro contexts exist, which are themselves macrocosms for further expressions of the manifestation of potential. Similarly, that macro context is itself a microcosm of a larger, even more inclusive macro context. In the extreme macro, the extent of the continuum of expressive potential is infinite to the extent of absolute infinity. However, within the context of any given manifestation, the continuum is finite to the extent of the particularization of expression required for interconnected growth to take place. In that finite context, the course of evolution develops to the extent it is not hampered due to acute or chronic environmental conditions, and will expand through emanation to express the latent potential of its seed force. In the case of an environment, the seed force is the expression of potential at its birth, the partnership between the matter and the energy that gives rise to its manifestation. Any given entity represents a set of potential that is manifestly expressed through engagement with energy. For an environment to reach its potential for manifested form, it must allow for the gradual evolution in time through selection of that which it births. The selection process is defined by objective necessity. It is a strict balance of manifested interests within the context of the environment. Any time the environment shifts, it favors certain manifestation over other manifestation. These shifts can either increase the unfolding of potential through evolution, or can decrease the unfolding of potential by hindering the possibility for evolution. The unfolding of potential within this context increases until it meets the limitations imposed by the characteristics of the environment, and then stabilizes in dynamic balance until the environment shifts again. All manifestation changes over time, and as environments change, the dynamic balance of the microcosms within that macro environment change accordingly. When environments remain consistent over long periods of time, the ability for organisms within those environments to reproduce according to more specific environmental characteristics increases. In that case, the diversity of the embodied life grows to meet the increasing ability for the environment to provide. The extent of the complexity of provision is precisely met by the extent of the complexity of embodied life within the environment. As embodied life expands in its representation, the expression of potential is made manifest as a resource within the environment. It is no longer latent, but rather expressed as particular influences that together balance to indicate the constitution of the whole. All manifestation expresses inherent interest through the specific nature of its manifestation. With the expression of inherent interest comes the influence of that expression in the environment in which it is manifested. The influence of a particular expression will strengthen to the extent it is relied upon within the environment. To the extent a given embodiment evolves to exert influence on the elements of its environment, it may manifest itself more completely as a representation of that environment's interests. This increasing range of expression towards totality of potential in a given environment over time gives rise to the evolutionary possibility for the development of reflective awareness. Reflective awareness allows the reflective understanding of the innate impetus that is structured into the function of the organism. This innate influence is the result of the simultaneous linked evolution of mind and body as a singular expression of seed force or spirit. By understanding innate function through reflective awareness, the organism gains the ability to recognize how, within a given environment, certain functions may be encouraged or discouraged to achieve different results that are more or less favorable to the organism itself. The effective guiding of the manifestation of potential gives rise to the flourishing of that which the guidance actually functions to support. The complexity of function is determined by the complexity of the manipulated system relative to the complexity of the manipulating organism. To the extent the manipulating organism fails to control for its effect, to limit its own influence to that which it comprehends, it may inadvertently cause potentially detrimental effects. To the extent the manipulating organism manipulates its environment in ways that bring about detrimental effects, its realization of its own potential will be limited. Avoidance of detrimental effects in the context of manipulation is accomplished through understanding and acting in accordance with the balance of the overall interconnected system that allows the organism's existence. This alignment of interests must occur in the macro as well as in the micro sense of the specific environment in question. The manipulation of environments, in the absence of an objective account of the system's own requirements, leads to a depletion of the system's potential to the extent it is hindered as a result of the manipulation. Nature, biosystems, biodiversity, destruction. Reductions in the manifested potential of expression in a given environment result from the diminishment of the environment's ability to support a given organism or array of organisms. All manifestation is subject to change. Change can be caused at the experiential level of any given organism by factors representing the full continuum of macro to micro influences. In the relative absence of reflective awareness and corresponding manipulation, and in the absence of extreme inter-environmental impositions, the expression of potential manifests itself according to the extent it has the capacity to generationally respond to the requirements of its environment. Where the characteristics of the environment change at a rate that surpasses the rate at which the manifested organism can generationally adjust, then the organism has to shift to another environment that bears sufficient similarity to the environment to which it is adapted, or it will cease to exist, and its expression, the evolved formal impetus of potential, is lost. In a given environment, changes to macro elements affect all of the micro elements that exist within the context of the extent of the macro influence. Macro elements can consist of the characteristics of the unfolding of the environment's innate potential, or of the result of inter- or intra-environmental elements being imposed into the environment to create an element of influence that changes the overall balance of the environment's provision. Any such shift will benefit some organisms and be a detriment to others. The benefit or harm will manifest to the extent those organisms are either innately suited to the new environment or can generationally and competitively adapt quickly enough to survive. Macro elements can also consist of the effective organisms that have evolved to the point of reflective ability, where any organism in its environment manipulates its environment to further its interests. The resulting changes in the environment at the micro level are specifically purposed to favor a certain state of manifestation. This manipulation to the benefit of one element risks the loss of entire branches of evolved manifestation. Everything that is impeded or removed from the environment impedes or removes every aspect of manifestation that is reliant on its presence. Likewise, everything that is encouraged or added to an environment impedes or removes aspects of manifestation that are incompatible with the interests of the added manifestation. Where the results of those shifts collectively are systemic, they have the potential to manifest as macro shifts in the environment as a whole. In that way, the manipulation by a given reflective organism to suit its own intention in the micro can result in macro risks to its own continued existence. Where a reflective organism fails as a result of a decrease of environmental provision due to the organism's own manipulation, the energy of potential developed and maintained in the reflective organism is released to be re-embodied by whatever form is most suited to the current environment. If the environment is one that has itself been disrupted in respect of its generation of manifested potential, then the redevelopment will start from that which is innately preferred by the conditions of the reformed environment, and the complexity of manifestation reverts to the highest state that remains intact. Then the branching begins again, but in the moment, a loss of achieved potential, which may or may not be achieved again, has occurred. Nature, biosystems, interconnectedness, evolution. In a closed system, all manifestation develops within the expressive range of already manifested potential. In the context of that development, organisms manifest in concert with all others in a web of mutual development. Each innately acts to feed both itself and its environment. This evolution of the manifestation of potential is generational and represented in the physicality of the organism, as well as in its intention as represented by its traits of influence, the function which it is innately designed to achieve, as limited by its actualized capacity within its environment. This evolution of the manifestation of potential is generational and represented in the physicality of the organism, as well as in its intention as represented by its traits of influence, the function which it is innately designed to achieve, as limited by its actualized capacity within its environment. For organisms that have not evolved to achieve reflective awareness, the intention is simply the result of innate design. The effect of its presence within its environment is a matter of its inherent traits alone. For organisms that have evolved to achieve reflective awareness, the intention is the result of innate design magnified by manipulative ability, the ability to consciously change the environment to exponentially favor the manifestation of their perception of innate purpose. All organisms naturally favor their own innate purpose by satisfying their survival instinct. The survival instinct reaches to protect all that is seen as being vital to the life of the organism and its progeny, in direct proportion to the perceived proximity of purpose. The development of this mutual reliance is endemic to the process of evolution. Within the context of reliance, organisms gain security. Increased diversity of manifestation is itself a representation of the actualized manifestation of potential within an environment. But increased diversity also has the effect, once existent, of securing further manifestation of potential in that greater diversity provides greater overall resilience of manifested potential in the context of environmental shifts. With the temporality of manifestation comes change. Because of the inevitability of change, organisms must adapt to their environments over time, whether in the context of individual interactive existence or in the context of generational interactive existence. This paradigm applies not only to specific micro-manifestations, but also to manifestation as a whole within a given macro environment. As applied to manifestation as a whole within a given macro environment, the flexibility that results from diversity derives from the increased expendability of specific microenvironments as change occurs. The loss of microenvironments is aligned with the intent of the overall manifestation of potential, provided the loss is limited and not ultimately diminishing to the manifestation of potential within the environment as a whole. Nature, biosystems, interconnectedness, reliance. In a closed system, all species rely on the range of manifestation that sustains them within their ecosystem. The connections between organisms within the context of that system differ depending on the extent of direct reliance. Organisms manifest where and how it is relevant for them to be manifested. Relevance includes the support of related organisms and the support of the matter and energy required for the organism to achieve its potential. The relevance of two entities to one another is the measure of their mutual reliance. Entities that have evolved into states of relative complexity over time and without disruption exist within a more complex network of mutual reliance. The extent of reliance between two entities in a complex environment is diminished where the provision required is otherwise available. The failure of one relationship can be compensated for by the development of other available sources of provision. In a simple environment, the reliance is more acute. There are fewer sources of provision. Any given set of organism holds greater vitality within the context of the environment. More is put at risk with its loss. To protect against the threat of loss, organisms reproduce and also provide support to the overall reproductive process, including nurture of progeny, to the extent the environment allows. Organisms co-evolve with the environments in which they exist and with the other organisms manifested within those environments. All organisms innately expect the presence of others and are reliant on others, either directly or indirectly. Each organism acts as a support for the next. As specific representations of energy-infused material characteristics, each interacts according to its own characteristics. In a closed system, no organism is irrelevant to the others. In an open system, none are irrelevant to the whole. Organisms rely on other organisms in their effort to manifest their potential. At a base level, they feed off other organisms in order to live, while providing food for others when they die. At a more complex level, organisms innately coordinate to support the individual existence of others of like kind, where that support increases their own ability to manifest their own potential. Nature, resource base. Particular, subjective perspective. Subjective perspective, whether innate or developed, is the base state of the manifested entity. It is a measure of the interest of the entity in itself, the measure of the entity's intent toward the manifestation of its own potential. In the case of innate subjective perspective, the intent is the built-in result of the manifestation and its requirements. The manifested entity, through the mechanism of its basic characteristics, views its environment and responds according to innate selected instinct, to value what it knows to value and protect itself against what it knows puts it at risk. The innate subjective perspective thereby reflects the survival instinct of the organism. It is its own fundamental understanding of what is required for its survival in the course of serving its own innate intent to manifest its potential within its environment. Where an organism evolves to develop reflective awareness, including the ability to consider itself within the context of environment, the capacity of subjective perspective increases in potency. This increased capacity can be employed towards various objectives, but to be employed towards any objective beyond that gleaned by the innate subjective perspective, such as empowered base-level development of security through avoidance or destruction of potential threats, requires the development of the ability for rational consideration. If the potency achieved through reflective awareness is employed towards a subjective perspective with limited regard for context, then the organism risks losing objective connection with its environment, thereby putting its gained perception at risk. If the potency is employed towards a heightened regard for context, then the organism may strengthen itself through its recognition of interconnection within its environment, and then through increased support of its environment, bring about gains to itself. If the potency is employed toward the diminishment of the influential force of the subjective aspect, through intent to directly embody the objective, then the organism may accelerate its own evolution by framing its reflective intent increasingly upon manifestation of greater potential. The pursuit of objective beyond the subjective aspect requires a deeper consideration of environment than a simple recognition of immediate mechanistic need. It requires a consideration of the balance of subjective needs as set against the objective need of the environment to manifest overall potential. In this way, the objective intent acts as a bolster within the overall environment against the empowered pursuit of pure subjective intent. The organism must recognize the intentional forces at play within an environment and discern their nature as set against the overall objective intent. This mechanism applies to innate intent, in that any organism must recognize the base characteristics of its environment in order to continue to pursue objective intent, but it applies with a greater power of relevance to the intent of organisms that have acquired reflective awareness, but have not yet acquired an ability for rational consideration that is sufficient to govern their own subjective intent. The mechanism has particular pertinence in the context of reflective intent because of the capacity for organisms capable of reflective intent to manipulate environments regardless of whether those manipulations are aligned with the seed environment's objective interest in the manifestation of the full extent of its overall potential. Nature, resource base, particular, understanding of interrelation. For so long as subjective perspective is confined to the innate mechanism, the organism will act in concert with the immediate environment of which it is a balanced part. The intentional understanding of interrelation is not manifested where perspective is limited to the innate mechanism. The embodied interrelation at this stage is automatic. The transcendence of subjective perspective comes about through and requires a consideration of manifestation beyond that of clear, immediate concern to the organism's innate subjective interest. The environment of the reflective organism is that with which it interacts. The substance of the consideration taken into account represents the nature of the reflective organism. By considering the full available import of manifested existence, and through its evolution, its potential, the reflecting entity may generate a rational appreciation of the role of directed evolution in the realization of potential. Directed evolution comes with reflective awareness, but it must be channeled through rational consideration if it is to act intentionally in support of the interests of the organism. Rational consideration allows the informed direction of evolution and requires the organism to appreciate the necessity of an environment that corresponds to its capacity. Where the subjective perspective grows without engaging rational consideration to its reflective awareness, its associated risk grows. Where heightened capacity develops in the absence of a corresponding rational faculty, the subjective interest becomes a liability to its environment and to the organisms that rely on the consistency of the environment. The rational faculty is the guidance system that regulates the more short-sighted empowered intent of the organism. It allows the organism to recognize the hierarchy of being, the need to attach intent to the support of the manifestation of potential through the choice of objective. Directed evolution must recognize its objective through rational consideration, or it will undermine itself in short-sighted attempts to satisfy its own survival instinct. In the absence of rational consideration, the survival instinct will cause the organism to dominate its environment without sufficient regard for the extent to which it itself relies on interrelation with that environment and the organisms within it. The ability to manipulate the environment is not proof of rational consideration, only of a base level of subjective reflective awareness. The extent of rational consideration is represented in the extent to which the directed evolution is guided towards the satisfaction of objective perspective. The realization of objective perspective by an organism with reflective awareness allows that organism's intent to be aligned with the requirements of the environment. It provides the principle by which further development of evolution must be directed. Nature, resource base, abstract, objective perspective. The development of objective perspective is at the core of the rational consideration available to guide the reflective entity in its allocation of manipulative energy. Objective perspective is the intentional result of rational consideration employed to transcend base subjective intent. The development of objective perspective is the development of the ability of the reflective organism to comprehend the value structure of influences within the environment, to understand its own purpose within the intent of the unified macro environment. It also makes an increased rate of evolution possible within specific micro-contexts. If the specific evolution is aligned to the intent of the overall environment, then the increased rate of evolution may benefit the positive manifestation of potential. Once the rational faculty has attended itself to regulate the power of subjective manipulation sufficiently to develop a secure situation over time, then the rational faculty may attend itself to the consideration of the influential forces behind different representations of subjective intent. The rational faculty alone is sufficient to govern behavior to the extent of the immediate clear interests of the physical organism. This is enough to prevent a certain degree of disruption to its environment, including itself and that which it relies on. In effect, at its most basic level, the rational faculty allows increased efficiency in the pursuit of the subjective intent. In the process of beginning to serve the subjective intent, the rational faculty soon comprehends the immediate outlines of interconnectedness and reliance. This realization itself is the first step in the rational faculty's appreciation of its role as a governance mechanism. The key recognition is in the rational appreciation that the pursuit of the subjective intent requires the consideration that, within the macrocosm of the subjective intent, different microcosms of intent exist and must be balanced in their influence to achieve the desired result, the overall subjective intent, the pursuit of the organism's interests as a whole. The more the rational faculty considers these different interests, its sensitivity may broaden to recognize such interests outside of itself and to value those interests accordingly. This includes macro factors within the environment, factors whose effects may not attend themselves in the present, but rather in the future in the experience of the rational faculty's generational progeny. The rational faculty is thus what allows, in respect of consideration for desired environmental manipulation, the transcendence of the limitations of immediate temporal existence. The rational faculty is the foundation required to consider the needs of the organism projected into the future. The foundations of objective perspective are in the ability of the rational faculty to guide the organism according to interests that are steps removed from its immediate apparent subjective interests. The moment the rational faculty requires a compromise of the immediate subjective interests of the organism, its governance according to objective consideration has begun. Nature, resource base. Abstract, guidance of choice. The extent of accessible manifestation becomes a substance that feeds reflective awareness. Reflective awareness gains only so much as it actually considers with rational intent. Rational intent requires that the manipulation of environment be consistent with the maintenance of the complexity of the environment. The greater the complexity of the environment, the greater the resource the environment provides towards the generation of objective consideration. Objective consideration grows out of the explorations of the rational faculty into the interests contained within its environment, both in the macro and in the micro. Objective consideration exists on a continuum from the most basically applicable upholding of subjective intent as manifested in the survival instinct to the empathetic intellective consideration of the role of organisms several steps of relevance removed from immediate concern to abstract principles that apply fundamentally to the facets of intent itself. The development of objective consideration in the guidance of choice mirrors the development of the rational faculty to consider an increasing array of influences in the form of physically and psychically embodied manifestation. Through the development of generations of intellective and emotive experiences, the rational faculty attends itself to and internalizes the value of the extent of the import of the objects of its consideration. For this reason, the rational faculty must, for its own positive evolution, extend itself beyond the microcosm of the organism's own subjective interests. The rational guidance of choice ultimately requires consideration of objectives. Choice itself requires a balancing and valuation of interests. The import of an interest as a result of valuation is the import of the influence of that interest. The addition of influence changes the balance of the environment available to be considered. At this level, the objects of intellective and emotive consideration are equivalent to the nutritional content available to the organism as a matter of the maximization of its manifested potential embodiment within its environment. By sustaining the maximization of physical, emotive, and intellective potential, the organism makes possible the maximization of objective consideration in the guidance of choice. The valuation of interests in these contexts allows for extended consideration through the imaginative faculty. It is through the imaginative faculty that rational consideration may confront the abstractly embodied influences that govern the environment as a whole, that represent macro interests of intent to the extent of the absolute. Human beings, individually and collectively, are organisms that have evolved within an interconnected and mutually reliant webbed network of other organisms, including other humans and all other animals and plants on the planet. All organisms on the planet are the embodied result of the shifts required to overcome the changes in the environments their ancestor organisms experienced. All organisms within any environment, from the macro to the micro, exist to the extent their environment supports their growth. The longer an environment is sufficiently stable for an organism to survive through reproduction, the greater the opportunity for that organism to regenerate sufficiently to develop in its capacity for manipulation of both itself and its environment. Humans have evolved sufficiently to have developed reflective awareness. This relative awareness allows a magnification of subjective intent in the manipulation of environments. With further evolution, humans have developed the rational faculty, not just to manipulate environments for their subjective interest, but also to consider factors of import to the progeny of the organism, or to the interests that are only indirectly applicable to the human. This extension of intent beyond the subjective is objective consideration. Objective consideration allows the influence and embodiment of abstract interests of greater import than immediate subjective consideration would allow. Environment, nurture, stress, physical growth. Stress is the application of challenge and can be applied individually and collectively. Challenge comes about as a result of competing influential elements within an environment. These elements can be entities that are part of the environment itself, such as climatic conditions, or other organisms within the environment, which compete for resources within the environment. In the innate subjective experience, the experience of stress is innate, enmeshed with the survival instinct. This innate stress pertains to anything that the organism, through its inherent traits as represented in the structure of its physical and behavioral manifestation, knows to be wary of. This is survival stress, the manifested physical and emotive response to a recognized proximity of a potential for harm. Survival stress for the innate subjective entity is the greatest stress. In addition to survival stresses are lesser stresses. These are the stresses that come from influential forces that increase the potential for harm, but not to the point of a risk of survival. They may include a particularly cold winter or a temporarily diminished supply of food. They may mean that the organism will not die, but may need to work harder or travel further in order to live. Lesser stresses also include stresses that are not at all life-threatening, but inevitably require the strengthening of the entity, which then makes the entity stronger in the context of confronting greater stresses. Stresses of this order might include the stress the body absorbs when covering rough or steep terrain, or by climbing trees, or by moving fast. In the development of mobility and agility, the animal may not only find food, it may also better escape predators and be more resilient to changing environmental conditions. Stress applies not only to animals, it also applies to plants. It is a mechanism that recognizes potential for threat. In recognizing a potential threat, the organism may respond by adapting to counter the risk through the development of resilience. At the level of manifested life as a whole, resilience to threat is achieved through biodiversity. The evolution of life to exist in as many different environments as possible increases the probability of some form of life surviving any given planetary threat. At the level of a given species, resilience may be achieved through the development of a specific trait, such as thicker fur in Arctic animals, or blubber in warm-blooded sea creatures, or through the development of opposable thumbs in humans. At the level of the individual, resilience may be achieved through physical fitness by which to better navigate the physical environment without injury. Stress is inherent in a constantly changing, closed and competitive environment. The better that ambient stress is managed, the more able the organism is to compete. At the innate subjective level, this stress management is automatic. It is embodied in physical characteristics as well as in behavioral patterns, such as play, that mimic the conditions of conflict, whether that be through chasing or through fighting. With the development of the rational faculty, the individual human has the ability to employ controlled stresses in order to instigate adaptation towards increased resilience. In the physical context, this involves the strengthening of the body through controlled stress. Controlled stress of the body means exercising the muscles of the body to trigger them to develop in strength and capability. This controlled stress can be employed to increase strength to the extent required to better manage ordinary daily tasks. It might further be employed to heighten the capability of the body to effectively navigate situations that the person might potentially experience. In the former case, the resilience of the person is intact so long as environmental factors remain consistent. In the latter case, the resilience of the person remains intact also in an array of less likely but possible scenarios. The purpose of strengthening through controlled stress is to account for the unknown and unexpected. It is to evaluate the import of potential scenarios and prepare for them where to not do so would result in a situation that is both unwanted and avoidable. The principle behind the implementation of controlled stress is not just precautionary. By developing ability, the body develops awareness through the memory embodied in the structure of bone and muscle, and through that memory, the agility that comes with the experience of use. These characteristics of awareness, preparedness, and agility are instituted into the person's emotive structure. The resulting state of increased mobility allows for a greater ability to collect positively substantial experience. As a vehicle for the interactive intent of the mind, the body's main purpose is to bring the mind into touch with enriching experience by which it may develop itself. The ideal controlled stressing of the body takes into account two factors. The first is the environment, including the risk factors inherent in the environment and the requirements the environment imposes in the context of provision. The second is the capacity of the vehicle itself, what the actual body is capable of when managed perfectly. The individual's response to environmental requirements either allow or disallow the second factor regarding the potential capability of the individual. Where individuals attend only to the base level requirements of the environment as a matter of provisioning, they fail to see their presumption of environmental consistency. The more rigorously the attention of the individual is limited to prevent consideration, the more this presumption is able to take hold. This failure to attend to the complexities inherent in the environment over time results in such individuals collectively losing attendant awareness of their environment, which will result in costs when the difference is realized. Where individuals are aware of risk factors but do not attend to achieving resilience against their potential through the implementation of controlled stress, They have not internalized the import of the risk factor. The individual recognizes that environments shift over time, but weight that present experience sufficiently highly to counteract the full realized appreciation of innate remaining potential. The result is the same. The costs accrue when the difference is realized. Where individuals meet the base level requirements to allow provisioning within the environment and further address with rational consideration likely potential threats and respond with the actualized development of resilience, those individuals have internalized the import of inherent risk factors and have increased their capability in the process. Where individuals achieve increased resilience, they may consider that through that increased resilience, not only is more protected against, but more is possible in terms of interactive experience, and that with that interaction, it is possible for increased levels of positively substantial import to be experienced. That realization allows the second of the two factors, the consideration of the potential of the physical and the maximization of the embodiment of that potential as a means of shifting threat arrays through holistic individual growth. For the mind of the individual to develop its utmost strength, its utmost resilience, it must first impose those rigors upon its own manifestation. Imposing those rigors requires understanding the function of the body both as a whole and as regards to attendant parts in the context of the environment. It means exercising each of those parts in combination with the others towards functional strength. Functional strength is the meeting of the practice with the purpose. The body has innate characteristics that allowed its species to survive. In the case of humans, those characteristics include the potential ability to run great distances through the combination of the design of the bipedal body and the ability to cool through perspiration. It includes the ability to climb and to grasp and manipulate material in the environment using the hands. And it includes the brain, which effectively compensates for the lack of relative speed and strength and the lack of inbuilt weapons through the tactical and potentially strategic direction of the body. While environmental conditions change over time, the means of overcoming those conditions effectively remain consistent. The means consist of maximizing the capability of the body towards strength and agility. They consist of maintaining that strength and agility, even outside of the defensive context, so that they may be employed in the pursuit of increased positive substantial experience that feeds the emotive and intellectual experience of the mind. Environment. Nurture, stress, physical destruction. To the extent stress exceeds the organism's physical ability to manage the burden, the stress will weaken the organism. Stress refers to the burdening of the organism's ability to react to a requirement placed upon it within its environment. The weakening of the organism is a realized overburdening of the organism's ability to adapt to the changing circumstance. If the organism is to avoid weakening through overburdening, then it must develop its resilience to avoid the potential for overburdening. All physical structure manifested in an environment has characteristics that are strengthened by certain factors within their environment and weakened by others. The ability to achieve and sustain the manifestation of potential over time requires the protection of the organism's own interests in the manifestation of its own potential. This means employing its innate faculties to feed its body and protect its body within the environment. This applies not merely to the individual itself, but also potentially collectively, where innate mutual reliance with others reinforces the organism's protection of itself. For the rational reflective organism, it requires, in addition, the protection of sources of sustenance and the protection against forces that would cause the failure of sustenance. Failure of sustenance for the reflective organism can stem from environmental factors outside of the control of the reflective organism, and from environmental factors within the control of the organism, such as mismanagement of influence within the environment as a result of short-sighted subjective intent. The rational reflective organism must control the stress imposed by the subjective intent so as to diminish the potential for that stress to weaken the organism to the point of extinction. Uncontrolled stress does not need to result in extinction to render harm. Stress increases when the physical structure of the organism is burdened. Where the stress is controlled, the organism will strengthen. Where the stress is uncontrolled, it may injure the organism. The rational reflective organism must apply controlled stress in order to strengthen to diminish the potential for uncontrolled stress to weaken the organism to the point of disability. Disability of the organism is only sustainable where the environment allows for it. In the innate state of existence, disability means extinction. In the subjective reflective state, it may be sustained until the costs of mismanagement as a result of the subjective reflective intent accrue and the organism is returned to the innate state. In the rational reflective state, disability may only be sustained to the extent it does not impede the overall strength of the organism towards the manifestation of its objective potential through the pursuit of positive substantial import, the path of ever-increasing controlled stress. Environment, nurture, stress, intellectual, growth. In the innate experience, the mind is melded to the function of the body and experiences and represents the stress of the body directly. In the reflective state, the mind experiences a state of stress that is functionally separate from the body. In the reflective state, the mind develops or weakens through stress, just as the body develops or weakens through stress. And just as the enriching experience of the body is to be appropriately fed and tested for strength, so is the enriching experience for the mind to be appropriately fed and tested for strength. The mind's nutrition is the information to be gleaned from interactive experience. The mind will be the result of the interactive experience the body has allowed it to encounter and navigate. The encountering of experience forms and molds the mind according to the influences contained within the experience to the extent they are imported. The experience of stress in the mind, just as in the body, is the difference between expectation and experience. Reflective stress can arise in the subjective context or in the objective context. In the subjective context, stress arises as a result of a perceived threat to the organism's considered interests. Some of those interests are objective in that they are in fact necessary to the organism's ability to achieve its potential. Others are subjective in that they are not necessary but are considered necessary. This is the difference between need and desire. In the subjective context, the failure of the environment to fulfill a desire causes stress to the mind. The level of stress experienced will match the degree of investment placed on the desire regardless of actual need. This stress weakens the mind unless and until it triggers recognition of the difference between need and desire. Stress as an emotive response must be calibrated to comply with the reality of the environment as it is. In the objective context, the mind may experience stress where its need-based interests are threatened as a result of the potential failure of its environment to provide. But that is its innate response. It may also experience stress where reasonable expectations are not met as a result of subjective intent within an environment that would otherwise provide. In the human context, this applies to environmental degradation as well as to avoidable human conflict. In the context of rational reflection, the requirement is not to discard expectation, but rather to calibrate expectation in such a way as promotes the utmost manifestation of objective potential within the environment. The utmost manifestation for the human is the achievement of stability in the provisioning of innate interest within the context of the environment, such that the mind can then be allowed the ability to concentrate on imposing controlled stress upon itself in the pursuit of increased understanding through positive substantive experience. Controlled stress in the context of mind is fundamentally no different from controlled stress in the context of body. It is to train the mind first in rational discipline, then to use that rational discipline to restructure the subjective persona to meet the actual requirements of objective experience and objective potential. In the objective context, to the extent the environment does not meet expectation, the mind's experience must and is correct to include stress. Stress, where calibrated through rational intent to respond to threats against the achievement of objective potential, is a warning signal of fundamental importance. The correct response is not to revert by diminishing expectation to the innate. It is to act immediately and forcefully to extinguish the threat and build resilience against it arising and growing in potential again. Environment, nurture, stress, intellectual, destruction. In the innate context, the experience of stress in the mind is simultaneous with the experience of stress in the body. The stress is the expression of the body's innate senses. The mind's response is immediate to the body's response. The two together evolved to protect the organism. In the context of subjective intent, the reflective mind allows the magnification of manipulative ability. To the extent that manipulation in fact undermines the environment's provisioning ability, the developed expectation of the subjective mind will separate from the objective reality of the environment. The development of the expectation of the subjective mind must be managed by the development of the rational mind directed towards objective interests. To the extent the subjective mind is allowed to develop expectations that are not aligned with either innate experience or with objective interests, the subjective mind will experience stress. The stress first arises as ambient innate stress. It then grows more acute, and for the time it is experienced to an extent that is not yet functionally debilitating, it will be considered by the subjective intent to be managed. Yet this stress is not managed unless the cause of it is controlled. Where the cause remains uncontrolled, the stress grows until it becomes debilitating and disabling. Where the mind is disabled due to stress, it becomes unable to direct itself or its embodiment. Like an injured limb, the mind may suffer an acute diminishment of potential. This diminishment of potential can cause the failure of the organism to function effectively to procure provisioning for itself and its environment. It may also cause, where allowed by its environment, the total absorbance into the subjective aspect of the mind. Where the subjective mind is injured, it may either grow into rationality or may retreat into an innate version of itself. This is not the same as reverting to the pre-existing innate state, which is not possible. Rather, it is to revert to a reflective state devoid of objectivity to the extent that even a subjective manipulative ability fails. This is the state of mental instability, where the innate is clothed in subjective meaning and becomes for the organism the reality. In that particular context, failure to manage stress leads to a diminishment of the mind's ability to process specific tasks effectively. With each failure, the ambient stress level grows, which further impedes the efficiency of action, leading to more failures. In the overall context, failure to manage stress leads to instability of the mind and the diminishment of the mind's ability to perceive, digest, and navigate objective reality. The instability of mind shall be evident in time in the manifestation of body, as the mind shall govern the objective body according to a subjective intent that is disconnected from the body's objective need. Environment. Nurture. Application. Context of behavior, structural impetus. The structure of the human body provides impetus towards a certain manner of interaction within the environment. To take full advantage of the environment's provision as regards the body, mind, and spirit, the body must be strong and capable of navigating that environment with agility. It must be strong so that it can climb mountains, so that it can move over rocks, so that it can run between trees in a forest if it must. It must be lean so that it is light. The body must be of strengthened bone and muscle. It must be able to climb, to draw its body weight from the ground. It must be able to fall without injury. It must be able to manipulate its environment without tiring. It must be resilient to threats from the micro to the macro. It must be fed. It must be able to fight. No man, no woman should be sheep. No man, no woman should be defenseless. All must exercise to develop their own sense of power, their own sense of ownership of the vehicle they maintain. The vehicle must be respected. It is the vessel for the reflective mind, and the reflective mind is the beginning of the expression of spirit. The body must be recognized as a mirror of the spirit, as expressed by the mind. The spirit shows in the body, in its strengths, in its weakness, in its purpose. It shows it in its structure, in the limbs from the spine, in the protection of that which feeds, in the holding high of that which guides. The guided body becomes strong through reaching. It must be exercised to meet the guided mind's requirements. It must suffer with the mind the rigors of the spiritual path, the path ever upwards towards the summit of potential. Only from the summit may the guided mind meet the realized intent. Only through death may the spirit, dispersed and reset, know birth so that the process may begin again. The body must strain with the mind. It must be strengthened from the outset if it is to realize the guided mind's ambition. The structure of the body dictates the means. It is to run, climb, tumble, and fight. It must be capable in its strengths and resilient in its weaknesses. It must be trained to know its capacity. Only then may the mind find freedom. Environment. Nurture. Application. Context of behavior. Patterns of behavior. Like the mind, the body knows what has been provided. The child must be trained to welcome the opportunity to instigate controlled stress upon itself. It must be trained to recognize the purpose for the stress, the import of the stress. The child must not be given a choice. The child must be channeled in behavior so that its expectation is always to meet the guided ambitions of the mind towards the objective will of its spirit. The child's mind must ever be agile. The child's body must ever be agile. The child must never forget how to run. The child must learn how to fight. The child must know how to build and how to destroy. The child must witness this so that it learns what must be built and what must be destroyed. What must be built is resilience through strength. Resilience through strength in the pursuit of the objective will of the spirit, not strength in the subjective will of the mind. The child must know nature for its guide. The child must internalize the breadth of the environment that supports its life. This includes the community into which it grows, but more importantly, it must include the measure by which the community must be judged. The child must have no say, but must witness so that when it earns its voice, it will speak well. The child must be integrated within the community of adults so that it learns how little it knows. The adults must lead the child through their own example. The child must grow within the organism of the people of which it is a part. The child will learn what is provided. It will fill the space allowed to it. It will structure its brain on the space allowed. It will develop its patterns in that time. The failure to channel the development of those patterns effectively results in the development of subjective intent and the absence of the potential for objective guidance. If the child does not find its way back on its own, through force of spirit alone, then it will develop into a liability. Where an entire society allows its children to develop without adequate patterning, then the entire society is put at risk. This risk is magnified by the fact that within the group of undeveloped minds, the individual undeveloped mind goes unnoticed. The undeveloped mind becomes the norm, and the opportunity for contrast by which to trigger increased perspective is diminished. The child must grow to understand the difference between need and desire. The child must strive ever to meet retreating needs while shunning the approaches of desire. Like the horse, the child must be spurred to focus ahead and to move towards. Like the horse, the child will confuse itself where it is not focused. The child does not know what to focus on, so it must be guided. The child knows nothing of the complexity of the world it enters, or of the complications, so it must be taught. The budding of the child's subjective intent must be reined, with the imposition of, and then the internal development of, rational reflection. The child learns what to value by witnessing what its parents value. The child must see its parent value strength and resilience, guided by objective scales of value. The child must value the strengthening of its body, the strengthening of its mind, the strengthening of its ability to realize its own potential through reaching ever to satisfy the objective will of its spirit. The child must never learn to value that which feeds the subjective without regards for the objective. The child must never learn to shun that which feeds the objective while pleasing the subjective. The child must learn to seek that which is of objective substance, that which is nutritious to the body, nutritious to the mind, nutritious to the realization of the objective will of its spirit. The child must never learn false security. The child must learn that every gain must be protected. The child must learn that threats arise quietly. The child must learn to govern itself first on the basis of rules, then on the basis of principles. Principles must guide the actions of the adult if man is not to be ever in conflict. Children must learn principles through rules because they are not ready to understand principles, but the rules by which they must learn are the parameters set in place to implement underlying principles. The child must learn the rules without needing to learn the rules. The rules must be inherent in the way things are done, so that the patterns of behavior the child learns are consistent with the rules. As a child's rational capacity begins to develop, it becomes able to see the patterns behind the rules. It becomes able to reflect upon the reasons behind customs. It begins to know empathy, not just for its family, but for the entirety of the environment its family relies on to live. The child must be raised. The child must be trained. The child must be imprinted with the pattern of objective intent. The child must learn to be as rigorous with thought as with action. The child must learn to challenge its mind as well as its body. The child must learn what it is and what it can be. The child must never be satisfied. The child must strive. The child must understand its body, the function inherent in the structure. It must strengthen the entirety of the body by directing stress upon the entirety of the body, but always in the context of functional need, to run and to fight, to build and to destroy. The child must understand its mind, the role of the mind in guiding the body, the role of the mind in implementing the capability of the body in the pursuit of positive, substantive experience. The mind must require the body to set it where it may exercise itself in consideration of the implementation of manipulation. Environment. Nurture. Application. Externalities of behavior. Expanded temporal scope. child is new to the world and may only internalize a limited experience. It is upon the adult to consider its import in the present as well as its role within an expanded temporal scope. The development of the comprehension of principle comes about through the expansion of the temporal term applied. Principles represent the recognition of patterns that may or may not be evident in the short term, but which arise consistently in the long term. Principles are the fundamentals on which rules must be based. Principles are not apparent in the absence of an expanded set of consideration. Rules must change to the extent manifested circumstances change over time. Rules are the expression of applied principles. They are specific to circumstance. Through consideration of an extended temporal scope, principles crystallize in form. Recognition of an expanded temporal scope requires a consideration of the retained potential within the environment, the retained potential within the innate existence of the individual, and the retained potential within the subjective intent of the individual. Consideration of an extended scope realizes the necessity for strength and agility to be maintained in body and in mind. It recognizes the necessity for discipline to be employed in the maintenance of security. It recognizes the necessity for rigor to be employed in the trampling of that which would undermine the precarious balance that allows the benefit of contemplative existence. The context of the child is the present. The child lives an innate existence, but the child quickly develops subjective reflective awareness. Subjective reflective awareness, without objective guidance, allows a magnified import in the present of intent that is untempered by principle. The adult must employ rules, guidelines, to prevent the import of that intent into the environment. The adult must be the child's rational faculty until the child can employ its own. The child's ability to consider an expanded temporal scope develops as the child masters its immediate environment. The sooner the child is conditioned to be able to master its immediate environment, the sooner it is able to consider that environment in the context of the passage of time, in the context of what changes more over time, and in the context of what changes less over time. Then the child may begin to recognize, through consideration and learning, and through consideration and experience, the patterns that give rise to the principles by which its parents set the rules that govern the family, the principles by which the community governs families, the principles by which the state governs communities, the principles by which generations of forebears developed the framework of states, the principles by which frameworks were conceived in recognition of the innate understanding of millions of years in development. Environment. Nurture. Application. Externalities of behavior. Self-awareness. In the context of objective manifestation, self-awareness requires not only an understanding of the self in isolation, but also an understanding of the self in the context of environment. The child must learn that every action supports an array of interests, undermines an array of interests, and is functionally irrelevant to another array of interests. The interests that actions affect, whether to support or undermine, exist not only in the present, but also in the future. Further, the interests that actions affect, whether to support or undermine, exist not only in the proximate, but also in the removed. In both cases, where the actions are mirrored by those of others within the environment, an exponential effect may arise, both spatially and temporally. In the extreme, this effect can consist of the removal of entire species of organism through extinction, or the entire breakdown of ecosystems required by countless organisms to live. In the less extreme, it can mean a material difference in the characteristics of the environment into which progeny grows. This material difference can be to the objective benefit or the objective detriment of the progeny in question. Self-awareness requires knowledge of potential strength and potential weakness. It requires pride in the development of strength, humility in the recognition of weakness. It requires recognition of the individual as both a macro and micro aspect within its environment. It requires appreciation of all that is at the mercy of a given decision. It requires a simultaneous recognition of the individual's own insignificance. The development of self-awareness beyond the subjective is the development of rational reflective awareness. It is a recognition for the potential for harm and the bolstering of the potential for benefit through pursuit of objective intent. Any cost created but not borne, instead made latent, will be borne by progeny. The individual must govern himself. The child must be raised such that upon its maturity the society should not need rules. The rational adult guided by principle also has no need of rules. Rules are for the management of those that are unable to manage themselves. Where the adults of a society cannot govern themselves, a society already suffers. In this case, a society has lost touch with its recognition of expanded temporal scope. The adults have become children, or the children never grew into adults, except in their apparent physical form. The society continues, it falters on, thinking it manages its risk through its rules, all the while building cost in the friction, building pressure in the growing difference that results from the development of manipulation rooted in the subjective intent of those who happen to hold power. The society collapses when the costs accrue, when the weather changes, when the neighbor sees the weakness in the corrosion of the society's infrastructure, corrosion unnoticed to the society itself, blind as it is in its childlike state to all but the decreasing present, to all but the decreasing immediate, to all but its rigorously protected decreasing sense of itself as the center of the universe. Environment. Conclusion. The innate organism acts automatically according to instinct derived from its physical function in the context of its environment. The reflective subjective organism, while continuing to act according to innate abilities, recognizes its ability to manipulate its environment to its perceived interest. The reflective rational organism, through consideration of its environment and through consideration of the effect of subjective intent, recognizes that the subjective intent must be governed to protect the integrity of the environment's ability to provide for the organism. The reflective objective organism, through recognizing the ability to manipulate the environment and through application of governance mechanisms, realizes the potential state of the organism and channels its intent towards that objective. In recognizing the objective potential state, the organism realizes the need to apply governance mechanisms not just to prevent the undermining of the integrity of the environment, but also to positively strengthen the organism within the environment. The controlled application of physical stress, according to functional application informed by innate structure, strengthens the organism's physical state and increases its ability to provide the organism's mind with positive, substantive experience. The controlled application of emotive stress allows the calibration of the emotive faculty to correspond with objective principle, so to usefully assist the intellect in guiding the navigation of the organism towards the embodiment of the objective principle. The controlled application of intellective stress allows a testing of the rational faculty for integrity and the strengthening of the rational faculty through the gathering of substantive experience of increasing import in respect of its pertinence and proximity to the objective state the organism emulates in order eventually to embody.